kind of weird and wiki. So I got a question first. Has anybody here read this book? None of them?
Not yet.
That's actually kind of cool. Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Wow. Okay. Yeah. No. Yeah. Okay. So basically, that makes me wonder how much setup I need to give. So when I first started daydreaming about the whole airship pirate thing 10 years ago and started writing these kind of songs, this stuff was all a lot noveler. But these days, if I say airship, everybody knows what I'm talking about. And even if I tried to describe the kind of airships that are used in this book, where it's like a balloon with a pirate ship hanging underneath, pretty much everybody's like, yeah. Once upon a time, that was like a really bizarre thing, and I found myself explaining it a lot, and then people were like, airship pirates? What did they pirate? Like, other airship pirates. But that was a long time ago, so luckily it's a little more thought out now. But so basically, in this particular story, it's weird that nobody has read it, because I'm trying to figure out what you can say about it that doesn't give too much plot away, but maybe that's not a real big deal. Okay, so I guess what I can do is I can just start reading the chapter, and raise hands if you have questions. That works. All right, so in the place that we're at now in the story, the main characters, being myself and some of the other members of the band, have found themselves on an airship. And it's an actual time-traveling airship from 100 years ago. And we're in contemporary times in the first couple of paragraphs, but we're getting ready to make the first jump back in time. The goal here is that the airship's supposed to be going back to where it started in the 1900s to make a return trip. And as you'll see, it's a little more challenging than just that. So I'm going to go ahead and read. You guys will be the first people I've ever read to in person that aren't my daughters. So hopefully I won't stop and define a lot of words. All right, so let's see. Phew, here we go. Okay. For a few days after the concert, we remained aloft, trying to stay in a bank of clouds that was drifting slowly east, while Dr. Calgary calculated the return trip to 1906. When he'd finished his calculations, the crew began to batten down the hatches, as they put it, tying down anything that was precariously attached. Most of the crew had dread in their eyes. From what I heard, jumping through time wasn't easy. On the maiden voyage, the ship was so battered by the journey that she was nearly unrepairable. We had basically spent the last week repairing damage from the first jump, and now we were about to do it again. The return jump would be equally hard, although Calgary had assured us that he had braced the weaker parts of the structure. I consoled myself with the thought that they all knew what to expect now and should be better equipped to handle anything that might happen. The crew, however, knowing what it would be like, was fortifying themselves with rum. Yeah, you laughed. So finally, the hour came to make the jump. I stood at a massive captain's wheel in what had become my quarters, having been warned that manning the on-the-deck bridge was too dangerous. Daniel was at my side, holding onto two large brass handles that were attached to the ceiling. Christina and Tanner were sitting at the newly bolted-down table and chairs to my right, throwing back shots of whiskey in order to prepare themselves for the turmoil of time travel. I later learned that this was the way of this crew, Daniel standing diligently ready to help, while the rest of the crew got drunk enough to overlook anything that needed doing. Lilith was, confusingly, applying makeup with an air of complete confidence and a lack of concern. That makes sense if you know that character. Let's see. Finally, Calgary's voice could be heard through the yelly phone, as I call it. It was a copper pipe that ran between the helm and the map room with a megaphone on each end. Really only worked if both parties yelled. "With your permission, Captain, I'm ready to throw the switch." I glanced at Tanner. He and Christina threw back the contents of their shot glasses before he stored the glasses in bottle. I then glanced back to Daniel, who pulled a rope of a steam whistle which notified the rest of the crew that we'd soon be off. "At your leisure, good doctor," I said, perhaps a little too enthusiastic. At first there was no noise, but then, out of my periphery, I could see two glass orbs that hung outside my windows, and they filled with pink glowing gas, a dark pink, the color of sky during a lightning storm. Then came a shudder in the ship, followed by a slight and unnatural sense of anxiety. It was not like a panic attack, but like a feeling of acceleration that had nothing to do with moving or dropping. Then my ears popped painfully. Instantly, a huge wind hit the ship as if a wall of stone was thrown against us. Windows smashed, lanterns swung and scattered against the wall. A rack of decorative swords and rifles crashed to the ground and flew across the floor. Daniel swung nearly perpendicular on his handles and hung there as the ship lurched to one side. There was a massive groaning of ropes from outside the cabin and a huge pling of at least one rope snapping loose. From elsewhere in the ship, I could hear men yelling back and forth to each other. Rain was now pelting the glass. Dr. Calgary later told me that the rain was from a change in air pressure between the time we left and the time we arrived and the varying altitudes we could be at. At two different air pressures, as the two different air pressures collided, a small but dramatic weather system would form. Occasionally, this would even cause snow. Finally, slowly, almost as if in slow motion, a bookshelf toppled from the wall and crashed on the floor, spilling books everywhere. This was too much for Christina and Tanner, and they burst into drunken laughter. Within a few minutes, the swinging and the shaking slowed to a gentle back and forth rocking, like a ship on mild waves. Daniel relaxed his grip on the handles and let his feet back to the floor and sarcastically said, "Well, that was fun. Let's get on deck and see when we are, because I totally trust the doctor to stick to a plan at this point." As we left the cabin, Tanner was already pouring Christina and himself another round. We left the cabin at the same time most of the rest of the crew was coming on deck. The clouds around us were burning off as fast as ice melts on a stove top, and they soon gave way to a warm and beautiful day. There were blue skies around us and emerald green seas below, and in the very far distance, to our rear, we could see a coast lined with palm trees. Below, and just ahead of us, sailing away from the coast, was a large three-masted ship, low in the water and heavily laden with cargo. It had 4 cannons per port side, and the deck was crowded with black-skinned, nearly naked African tribal people, sitting so tightly packed it seemed as though we were looking at a shipload of carved statues. Daniel and I extended our spyglasses. A closer look showed that the dark-skinned people were captives, chained to each other and chained to the boats itself. Then we saw a horrendous sight. At the aft of the ship, 4 clothed and fair-skinned men were struggling with one of the captives. His back was crisscrossed with blood. He had obviously been whipped, and the blood was running down his arms and legs, making it hard for the fair-skinned men to hold him. They had each arm or a leg, and as we watched, they tossed the body of the struggling man right off the ship. A mother held her screaming toddlers tightly against her naked breast, turning their faces away. One small boy of perhaps 8 ran to the men screaming in rage and was stopped by the sole of a boot that shattered his nose and covered his face in blood. This was obviously the ejected man's wife and children. It was her turn to be strong, and to be the strong mother and quiet her children. So she grabbed the 8-year-old and held him down with the others. Toddlers didn't become useful for many years, so they had no value. Later, when she slept, this young mother, now a young widow, would allow herself to cry. But not now. What was left of her family relied on her keeping control. I dropped my glass from my now red and moist eyes, and I turned to Daniel. "Where the hell are we?" I choked out. "What the hell is this?" "I think it's a slave ship. That coast must be Africa, and this ship is headed for the Caribbean." Dr. Calgary hobbled in between us, and "I'm afraid I've made some minor mistake in my calculations. This is the location I was targeting, but I did not intend to travel this far back in time. The slave trade was outlawed in 1806. If that's a slave ship, we're 100 years past our target, or say, 100 years too early." I turned to Daniel and said, "Daniel, get to the lower's crow's nest and loose the rope ladder." Being a soldier, he was immediately in motion, but he yelled back over his shoulder as he was climbing over the side rail, "Robert, what are we doing?" "We're saving a father and then a family, and then we're going to hurt some bad guys," I replied. In retrospect, this was a rash move. There are times to think and times to move, and this was not the time to stop and think. This father would soon be dead. Perhaps my rash actions were the result of a dormant, as of yet unneeded heroic tendencies, or perhaps they were the result of the rum in my belly. put there to calm my nerves. Perhaps the rest of the crew were so easily swayed to this new task because they themselves had been drinking. Or perhaps we were all born to be heroes. I sprinted to the bow helm and pushed the elevator wheel, which lurched the huge airship into a steep dive. "Easy, Captain, nearly lost Daniel there," yelled Jean-Paul as he watched over the railing. From where I stood, I couldn't see the other side crow's nest, but I could see the surface of the ocean approaching rapidly. "Jean-Paul, tell me when the lower mast is a few feet from the water, then get down there and help Daniel." Jean-Paul watched for a few seconds, then yelled, 3, 2, 1, level off. I heaved the elevator wheel and the ship slowly began to arc towards the level position, but much too slowly. There was a hard jerk followed by a spray of foam at the back of the ship as the mast dipped in. Water was tossed 20 feet high behind us, and a huge crack sounded from deep in the hull as the mast splintered. The African that had been tossed overboard was vainly swimming towards the ship that had dropped him. I saw him quickly disappear from under my view of the bow. I just had time to think, shit, that was quick. I hope Daniel and Jean-Paul had. "Huzzah, they got him!" yelled the crew watching from our side. I pushed a little harder and the airship began to climb again, and then I handed the wheel to one of the other pilots and ran to the edge. As he climbed over the ship's railing, I could see the African was tall, even taller than me, and rippled with blue-black muscles like a racehorse who had just finished running a race. He had tattooing, or sort of a decorative scarring on his face and shoulders, and his eyes burned with fear and anger as his arms shook with the adrenaline from the cold of the seawater and the wind of our forward movement. He stood dripping on the deck in a circle of our crew, not knowing who this new group of strangely dressed men were. There was a brief moment when it looked like he would spring on us. Since nobody could translate our intentions to him, I spoke to him in a language a father could understand. I put my sword in his hand, and I pointed towards his family's captors. Then I turned and yelled to the crew, "Full speed ahead, Daniel. We've got about 45 seconds to assemble 20 of your toughest fighters. Each man should carry 3 swords, and at least 2 men will lead bolt cutters and a very large hammer." "I think I understand you." "I'm on it," Daniel yelled, and the entire crew was in motion. I ran back to the stern helm and noticed that although this slave ship was the first ship, it was not the only ship in the water. 500 yards to port was a gunship, an escort to the other. It was altering its course now to converge on us. Shit, I thought, this is not going to be easy. Daniel and 20 burly armed sailors were starting to climb over the side and down the ladders to the lower crow's nest. One of them was Tanner. I grabbed him by the shoulders. "There's a lot of whiskey in you. Can you do this?" If there wasn't, I couldn't do it. In my present condition, however, I'm more than enthusiastic to do this, he replied with a starry-eyed grin. "Good point. Hand me the bottle." I pulled the cork out with my teeth, and I threw back more than I could take without it, or almost more than I could take without it coming back on me. It burned in my throat, and I vaulted over the railing. God, I hate whiskey. And that's true, I actually hate whiskey. So, let's see. We were converging on the slave ship at a startling pace. Our sails were down, but our propellers were roaring, and before I had a chance to wonder if I could make it to the bottom before we collided, I saw the mast of the slave ship tangle with our own lower mast. Simultaneously, the rear of the slave ship lifted from the water, while the bow of the Ophelia pitched forward, and several of our sailors were knocked from the rigging to the slave-filled decks below. The slavers were ready. Having watched our odd vehicle grab their discarded slave, they had a few minutes while we approached to get over the shock of a flying ship, and they leaped on our men the second we fell amongst the Africans. But here, they got a surprise. Bear with me while I explain. If the singer of a rock band leaps from stage into a massive and excited crowd, the crowds put their hands forward and upward, and crowd surfs him. They hold him aloft and move him around the room as if he was surfing on his back. In fact, this is called crowd surfing. Likewise, when the slavers leapt into the crowd of chained slaves to attack us, the slaves were not idle. They also had seen us pick up one of their own, and they saw us attacking their captors. So, when the slavers entered the crowd of slaves, 100 hands picked them up and tossed them overboard. In under a minute, only 18 slave ship sailors remained, and they were crowded into the center of the deck, back to back, keeping as far from the Africans as possible. Soon much of the crew of the Ophelia stood on deck too, some starting to cut loose and arm the grateful captives. We cut the slaves' chains with the large bolt cutters we had taken from a hardware store in Idaho in 2006.
Is this for the nonfiction content?
No, this is all true. In under a minute, only 18 slave ship sailors remained, and they crowded at the center of the deck, back to back, keeping as far from the Africans as possible. Soon, much of the crew of the Ophelia stood on deck too, some starting to cut loose and arm the grateful captives. We cut the slaves' chains with large... I read that already, didn't I? And you noticed, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
Okay, sorry. Let's see. The last man to climb down onto the ship was the African that we'd pulled from the water. With no hesitation whatsoever, he strode to the captain of the slave ship, raised skyward the heavy cutlass I gave him, and cleaved the captain's face and chest with one blow. He then turned and knelt and embraced his newly freed children as the rest of the crew ran past him and threw themselves into battle. Now this was to be my first real sword fight. But before you doubt the likelihood of my survival, let me say that I was on the fencing team, both in high school and college. And I had a half a bottle of cheap whiskey in me to keep my mind from telling me that these were actually sharpened blades. We and the now freed and armed slaves took no time whatsoever to mince their captors. As the fighting began to slow, I noticed my left arm was bleeding quite a lot. And as I looked at it, I heard a series of deep booms from the starboard side, followed by a shower of wood chips coming from above us. The escort ship, which I had forgotten until now, had come within range and observed the whole fight. They were now firing on the Ophelia. The first volley had smashed the wood of our belly, with pieces of that wood were raining down on our heads. The ship was a warship, huge and strong, and its crew were not slavers, but naval warriors. I could only watch as they fired a second round into our beautiful airship. As I stood there, useless, wondering what I could do from here, wondering how many hits our airship would take, I heard a distant, cockneyed voice above me yell, "Return volley!" And suddenly the starboard side of the Ophelia erupted in flame and smoke from our cannons. Daniel lay a hand on my shoulder. "Have no fear, Robert. The Ophelia is an airship, or an airborne warship, more than 100 years newer in design than that ship in the water. She was built to overturn battles. This is not going to be difficult." Our first volley cracked the railings and deckings of the escort ship, and either by good luck, skill, or fierce and vengeful karma, one cannonball went directly through the attacking ship's captain. As our crew loaded for the second round, I hoisted myself into the rigging and yelled, "Surrender now and be set free. Otherwise, prepare to die. I've got 50 cannon," I'm not really sure if that was true, "and 100 sailors," and I'm certain that was not true, "and we can sink you from a height your guns cannot reach if we choose. Lay down your arms." Instantly, the lower-ranking sailors began to drop their swords or step back from the cannons. The officers frantically conversed before one yelled back to me, "Hold your fire. What are your terms?" There was an obvious panic in his voice. "Surrender with no protest and we'll set you adrift in your dinghies. From here you should be able to return to the shore, but your ship we will take. The ship is too crowded and I've got a boatload of Maasai here that I think look like they could use it." In the months that followed, the seas became thick with tribal African warriors. We taught them to sail, to use cannon, and together we sought other slave ships and their escorts. 2 ships quickly became 4, and 4 became 8, and then 20, and so on. Each slave ship we overtook added sailors and warriors to their crews, and each escort ship they defeated added to the size of their armada. In under a year, slave trade was eradicated between Africa and the Americas. Soon the nations of the world had to ask permission from the United Tribal Navy of Africa for permission to sail through their waters. The UTNA was swift, strong, and merciless. I'm going to stop there. So in the story, we get all cocky after that, and we go through time thinking we're going to fix everything bad that ever happened, and of course that never has the kind of results that you think it's going to happen. Does anybody have any questions from that? Or any just general questions, or comments, or suggestions?